Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that really makes your modern skin crawl, something far removed from your heated floors and instant communication. We're stepping back into the chilling, often brutal reality of Victorian England, not into its gaslit streets or grand ballrooms, but into a place where sanity was lost and humanity often forgotten, the asylum. Forget what you think you know from period dramas. The truth was far grittier, far more desperate. I want you to truly feel what it might have been like to be on the inside, to experience the fear, the confusion, the sheer overwhelming lack of control. All right, find that cozy spot, maybe grab a warm drink and prepare to journey into the shadows of the Victorian mind, because it's going to be a heavy one. Imagine for a moment that you are living in a world utterly devoid of the nuanced understanding of mental health that we possess today. Your anxieties, your melancholic moods, your eccentricities, they are not simply facets of your personality or temporary struggles, but potential harbingers of something far more sinister, something that society views with a mixture of fear, superstition, and judgment. You live in an era where the line between what is considered merely odd and what is deemed mad is incredibly thin, often drawn not by medical science, which is still in its infancy regarding the brain, but by social convention, family convenience, and economic pressures. You might wake up one morning feeling a little more withdrawn than usual, perhaps less inclined to engage in the polite rituals of your daily life, and already, a quiet, insidious dread begins to creep into the corners of your mind. You're aware of the whispers, the hushed conversations, the sideways glances that people give to those who seem to deviate even slightly from the prescribed norms of behavior. This is the Victorian era, and your individuality, your unique way of processing the world, could very well be your undoing. The very concept of madness itself is a vast, terrifying, and ill-defined wilderness. It's not the clinical depression or bipolar disorder we recognize. It's a catch-all term for anything that upsets the delicate balance of societal expectation. A woman, perhaps, who speaks her mind too freely, who expresses an unseemly ambition, or who simply refuses to conform to the docile role expected of her, might find herself labeled as hysterical. A diagnosis so pervasive and convenient it could encompass anything from a headache to a desire for intellectual stimulation. A man who gambles away his family's fortune, or who experiences profound grief after a loss, might be deemed to suffer from moral insanity, a supposed defect of character rather than a medical condition. You, in this world, are acutely aware that your inner turmoil, the very struggles that might today lead you to a therapist's couch for compassionate understanding, could then lead you to a place from which there is little return. The fear isn't just of suffering. It's of being seen to suffer, of having your private pain become a public spectacle, a mark of shame not just upon you but upon your entire family. Consider the process of commitment, should you be unfortunate enough to fall under suspicion. It's not a careful, psychiatric evaluation by a team of specialists. No, it often begins with a family member, perhaps an anxious spouse, a concerned sibling, or even a greedy relative eyeing your inheritance. They might observe your withdrawal, your sudden outbursts, your uncharacteristic silences, and interpret them through the lens of their own fear and ignorance. The doctor, when consulted, might spend mere minutes with you, asking a few perfunctory questions, observing your demeanor, and then, with a stroke of a pen, seal your fate. There's no appeal, no second opinion, no advocate fighting for your rights. You might find yourself bewildered, protesting your sanity, only to have your fervent denials interpreted as further evidence of your derangement. See how agitated they are, someone might say, clearly they are not themselves. The very act of defending your autonomy becomes a weapon used against you. You are stripped of your voice, your agency, and your ability to define your own reality. The contrast with your modern world is stark, isn't it? Today, if you feel overwhelmed, you have a plethora of resources. Therapists, support groups, medication, confidential conversations with trusted friends. You have the right to informed consent, the right to refuse treatment, the right to advocate for yourself. In the Victorian era, these concepts are alien. Once the decision is made, once the papers are signed, your fate is essentially sealed. You become property, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be healed. The fear you might feel is not just for your immediate future but for your very identity. Who are you, if not the person you believe yourself to be? And if society, through its institutions, tells you that you are mad, truly and irrevocably mad, how long can you resist that narrative before it begins to seep into your own perception of self? The psychological burden of this pre-commitment period, the gnawing anxiety of being observed and judged, must have been utterly debilitating. You might begin to second-guess every thought, every feeling, every impulse, wondering if it's another sign of the encroaching darkness. The architectural presence of the asylum itself would have loomed large in the collective consciousness. These were not discreet, welcoming clinics. They were often imposing, Gothic structures, built on the outskirts of towns, designed to be seen and to inspire a sense of awe and dread. Their high walls, barred windows, and often isolated locations screamed containment rather than care. You would have seen them from afar, perhaps on a carriage ride, a monolithic presence against the horizon, and felt a shiver run down your spine. They were places whispered about, places where people disappeared, places where the boundaries of humanity seemed to blur. The very sight of one would have been a visceral reminder of the precariousness of sanity and social acceptance. The air around them, you might imagine, felt heavier, charged with unspoken suffering and the chilling weight of institutional power. And then there's the economic factor, a grim undercurrent that often propelled individuals into these institutions. For a wealthy family, an insane relative could be an embarrassment, a stain on their social standing, and a disruption to their carefully curated lives. Committing them to a private asylum where they could be kept out of sight and out of mind was often a practical solution, albeit a cruel one. For the poor, the situation was even more dire. If you, as a working-class individual, became unable to work due to mental distress, you became a burden, a drain on meager family resources, or a ward of the state. The workhouse asylum, a far more brutal and overcrowded institution, awaited those who had no means to pay for private care. Your social class, your financial standing, played a significant role in determining not only if you would be committed, but where and under what conditions. The injustice of it all is palpable, even from your comfortable remove in the future. You realize that sanity wasn't just a state of mind, it was in many ways a privilege. The fear of destitution, intertwined with the fear of mental collapse, would have been a double-edged sword, driving many to desperate measures to conceal their struggles, to put on a brave face, even as their inner world crumbled. So, as you contemplate this initial descent, this terrifying precipice upon which many Victorians stood, you begin to grasp the profound vulnerability of existence in that era. Your modern conception of self-care, of mental well-being as a right, feels utterly alien to this historical landscape. Here, the individual is subservient to the collective, to the family, to society's rigid expectations. Your mind, your very essence, is not your own to command or understand. It is something that can be seized, judged, and confined. The journey into the asylum is not just a physical one. It is a profound psychological severance, a tearing away from everything that defines you, a descent into an unknown world where the rules are different, and your very humanity is called into question. It is a world where the quiet hum of your own thoughts could be misinterpreted as the prelude to madness, and where the most basic human right, the right to self-determination, could be extinguished with terrifying ease. This initial understanding, this chilling realization, is just the beginning of our journey into the shadows. Segment 2, The Asylum's Gates, a foreboding welcome. You stand before them now, the gates. They are not the inviting, open thresholds of a modern hospital, nor the warm, reassuring entrance to a place of healing. No, these are formidable wrought iron behemoths, often topped with menacing spikes or intricate, coiling designs that seem more suited to a fortress than a sanctuary. The very air here feels different, heavier, laden with an unspoken dread that seems to cling to the damp stone and the rusting metal. The carriage that brought you here, perhaps jostling you for hours over uneven roads, has finally stopped, and the sudden silence after the clatter of hooves and wheels is almost deafening. You can hear your own heart thumping a frantic rhythm against your ribs, a desperate drumbeat against the encroaching silence of this place. The gatekeeper, a stern-faced individual with eyes that seem to see right through you, slowly, deliberately, swings one half open, the creak of the hinges echoing like a death knell in the stillness. This isn't an invitation, it's an undeniable, irreversible passage. As you step through, or perhaps are gently but firmly guided, the world you knew immediately recedes. The familiar sounds of the bustling town, the distant cries of street vendors, the comforting scent of wood smoke from a nearby hearth, they are all abruptly muffled, replaced by a profound quiet that feels more ominous than any noise. The walls are high, impossibly high, constructed of dark, often soot-stained brick or stone, designed not to keep the outside world out, but to keep you firmly within. You look up, and the sky, even if it's a bright, clear day, seems somehow diminished, framed by these towering barriers that promise perpetual enclosure. There's a subtle chill in the air, even indoors, a pervasive dampness that seeps into your bones, a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort of your own home, which now feels like a distant, unreachable dream. The smell hits you next, a complex, unsettling blend. The faint, acrid tang of disinfectant, the mustiness of old stone, the underlying scent of unwashed bodies and stale food, and something else, something indefinable but deeply disturbing, a scent of despair that seems to emanate from the very fabric of the building itself. You are no longer Mr. So-and-so, or Mrs. Such-and-such. Your name, your identity, the social standing you once held, these are shed at the gates like an unwanted skin. You are now a patient, an inmate, a number in a ledger. The very language used to describe you changes, reflecting your diminished status. You might be asked to surrender your personal belongings, your watch, your jewelry, any small trinkets that connect you to your former life. Your clothes, too, might be taken, replaced by a coarse, institutional uniform, often ill-fitting and scratchy against your skin. This act of stripping away your personal effects is not merely practical. It's a symbolic annihilation of your individuality, a deliberate severing of ties to the outside world. You are being remade, or rather, unmade, in the image of the asylum. The rough fabric of the uniform feels like a constant, physical reminder of your new reality, a scratchy shroud that binds you to this place. The initial intake process is often bewildering. You might be led down long, echoing corridors, the footsteps of your escort the only sound against the vast silence. The walls are bare, often painted a dreary, institutional color, gray, drab green, or a faded cream, offering no visual solace, no comfort for the eye. The light is dim, perhaps filtering through high, grimy windows or cast by flickering gas lamps that only deepen the shadows. You might glimpse other figures, other patients, through half-open doors or at the end of hallways. Their faces are often vacant, their movements slow and shuffling, or conversely, agitated and restless. Their presence is a silent, chilling prophecy of your own potential future. You see their eyes, some filled with a desperate, pleading intelligence, others completely clouded over, and you feel a tremor of fear, a desperate longing to turn back, to escape this nightmare before it fully engulfs you. But there is no turning back. The heavy gates have clanged shut behind you, sealing your fate. The sounds, too, contribute to the overwhelming sense of dread. Beyond the initial silence, you begin to discern a cacophony of unsettling noises. There are the distant, muffled cries and moans, sometimes a sudden, piercing shriek that cuts through the quiet, only to be abruptly silenced. There's the clanging of metal on metal, perhaps a door being locked or a restraint being adjusted. The shuffling footsteps of attendants, the creak of floorboards, the distant, unintelligible murmuring of voices. All these sounds coalesce into a symphony of institutional despair. Your modern ears, accustomed to the curated soundscapes of your daily life, the comforting hum of technology, the familiar rhythms of your home, would find this auditory assault profoundly disorienting and deeply disturbing. You yearn for the familiar, for the sounds that signify safety and normalcy, but here, there is only this unsettling chorus of confinement. The doctors and attendants you encounter during this initial phase are often figures of authority, their faces unreadable, their demeanor distant. They move with an air of practiced indifference, as if the suffering they witness daily has hardened them beyond compassion. You are not a person to them but a case, a medical problem, or perhaps simply a burden. Their language is clinical, their touch impersonal, and their gaze dispassionate. You might try to explain yourself, to assert your sanity, to plead for understanding, but your words seem to fall on deaf ears, or worse, are interpreted as further evidence of your delusion. You feel a profound sense of powerlessness, a chilling realization that your subjective experience, your inner world, holds no weight in this place. Your pleas are just noise, your distress just a symptom. This initial welcome is designed, whether intentionally or not, to break you down, to strip away your resistance, to force you to conform to the role of the mad patient. It's a psychological assault, a systematic dismantling of your sense of self and your connection to the outside world. The sheer scale of the institution, the uniformity of its design, the pervasive sense of confinement, all contribute to an overwhelming feeling of being a small, insignificant cog in a vast, uncaring machine. You are a pebble dropped into a deep, dark well, and the ripples of your former life quickly fade from view. The air presses in on you, the walls seem to lean, and the future stretches before you as an endless, featureless expanse of institutional gray. You realize with a sickening lurch that your journey into the asylum isn't just a change of address. It's a profound transformation, a descent into a different kind of existence where the rules of humanity you once knew no longer apply. This is the foreboding welcome, and it marks the true beginning of your life within these walls. The very air you breathe feels tainted, heavy with the history of countless lost souls who have passed through these same ominous gates. You are now one of them, utterly and terribly alone in a crowd of the similarly afflicted. The hope that clung to you, however faintly, during the journey here, dissipates like smoke, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of your new, terrifying prison. Once past the initial shock of arrival, you are assigned to a ward. This isn't a private room, a place of quiet solitude for recovery, but often a large, open space, stark and utilitarian, crammed with rows of beds. Imagine a vast dormitory, but stripped of any comfort or personal touch. The beds themselves are usually narrow, hard, and covered with coarse, often stained blankets. There's no privacy here. Your every movement, your every sound, is visible and audible to dozens of others and to the ever-present staff. You quickly realize that personal space, a concept you take for granted in your modern life, is a luxury utterly unknown within these walls. Your modern sensibilities, accustomed to individual bedrooms, quiet corners, and the ability to retreat, would find this constant, inescapable proximity to others profoundly unsettling, a ceaseless assault on your personal boundaries. The very air of the ward feels stagnant, heavy with the breath of many bodies, the lingering scent of illness, and the pervasive odor of institutional disinfectant that fails to truly mask the deeper, more unpleasant smells. The days unfold with a relentless, soul-crushing monotony. There is no schedule designed for individual therapy or personalized care, not in the way you understand it. Instead, there is a rigid, unvarying routine dictated by the needs of the institution, not the needs of its patients. You wake at a fixed, early hour, often roused by a loud bell or the sharp voice of an attendant. The morning ritual is swift and impersonal, washing in cold water, perhaps a communal basin with harsh soap. There's no time for lingering, no opportunity for self-care or personal grooming beyond the most basic necessities. You are dressed, often in the same coarse uniform, day after day, week after week. The very act of choosing your own clothing, of expressing a sliver of your personality through fabric and style, is a freedom you now mourn the loss of. This imposed uniformity is another layer in the stripping away of your identity, a constant reminder that you are no longer an individual but merely one of many. Breakfast is a meager affair, served in a communal dining hall that often doubles as a day room. The food is typically bland, unappetizing, and often cold. Thin gruel, hard bread, weak tea. You eat in silence or amidst the cacophony of other patients, some muttering to themselves, others making strange noises, still others staring vacantly into the middle distance. The experience is not one of nourishment or pleasure, but simply a functional act, a means to sustain a body that the institution views as little more than a vessel. Your modern palate, accustomed to variety, flavor, and the simple joy of a well-prepared meal, would find this dietary regime not only unsatisfying but actively depressing. The lack of choice, the sheer unappetizing nature of the fare, becomes another small, constant erosion of your spirit. After meals, the day is often filled with enforced idleness or meaningless, repetitive tasks. There might be some form of occupational therapy, but it's often more about keeping patients busy and controllable than about genuine rehabilitation. You might be set to knitting, sewing, or some other simple, repetitive chore that requires little thought and offers no sense of accomplishment. Or you might simply be left to sit on hard benches, staring at blank walls, with nothing to stimulate your mind, nothing to engage your intellect, nothing to lift your spirits. The hours stretch out endlessly, each one a mirror of the last. Imagine the profound mental toll of this enforced inactivity, this absence of purpose. Your modern life is filled with choices, with stimulation, with opportunities for learning and growth. To be suddenly plunged into a world where your mind is given nothing to do but churn on its own anxieties, where your body is allowed only the most basic functions, would be a form of torture in itself. The social environment on the wards is a complex, often disturbing tapestry. You are surrounded by people whose mental states vary wildly. Some are withdrawn, catatonic, barely responsive. Others are agitated, prone to sudden outbursts, or consumed by their own delusions, talking to unseen figures, laughing at unheard jokes, or weeping inconsolably. There is little genuine connection, little comfort to be found in shared experience, because each individual is so deeply immersed in their own private hell. The sounds of their suffering, their strange behaviors, become the background noise of your existence. You try to filter it out, to retreat into your own mind, but it is constant, inescapable, a pervasive reminder of the fragility of the human psyche and the depths of human suffering. Your empathy, if you allow it, would be stretched to its breaking point, constantly bombarded by the raw, unfiltered anguish of others. Interaction with the staff, the attendants and nurses, is rarely comforting. They are often overworked, underpaid, and poorly trained. Their primary role is often custodial, to maintain order, to prevent escapes, to administer treatments, and to ensure the smooth running of the institution. Compassion, empathy, and genuine understanding are often in short supply, replaced by a weary detachment or, in some cases, outright cruelty. You learn quickly to obey, to not draw attention to yourself, to become invisible. Any deviation from the rules, any expression of defiance or distress that is deemed inconvenient, can lead to punishment. You are always under surveillance, always being watched, always judged. The feeling of being perpetually observed, of having no private moments, no sanctuary for your thoughts, is profoundly dehumanizing. You yearn for a moment of genuine human connection, a kind word, a sympathetic glance, but these are rare jewels in a landscape of indifference. The physical environment itself contributes to the misery. The wards are often poorly ventilated, leading to a stale, heavy atmosphere. The sanitation, despite the use of harsh disinfectants, is often inadequate. Overcrowding is a constant problem, leading to a breakdown in hygiene and an increased risk of disease. You might witness outbreaks of sickness, the coughing and feverish struggles of fellow patients, knowing that medical care within these walls is often rudimentary at best. The beds are hard, the floors cold, the light dim. There is no beauty, no art, no nature to soothe the eye or calm the mind. The windows, if they exist, are often barred, offering only a tantalizing, frustrating glimpse of the outside world that is now irrevocably closed off to you. You might press your face against the cold glass, yearning for the sight of a bird, a tree, a cloud, anything that speaks of freedom and the natural world, only to be met with the unyielding iron bars. Sleep, when it comes, is often restless and disturbed. The sounds of the ward do not cease entirely at night. There are the groans, the cries, the shuffling footsteps of night attendants, the distant clanging of doors. Your mind, devoid of external stimulation during the day, might race with anxieties, with memories of your former life, with the terrifying certainty of your present predicament. You might find yourself dreading the dawn, knowing it will bring another day identical to the last, another cycle of monotony and misery. The dreams you have, if any, are likely to be fragmented, unsettling, reflecting the fractured reality of your waking hours. This life on the wards is a slow, grinding process of dehumanization. It's designed, perhaps unintentionally, to strip you of everything that makes you an individual. Your name, your clothes, your choices, your privacy, your purpose, your connections, and ultimately your hope. You are reduced to a basic biological entity, a body to be fed, housed, and controlled. The sheer boredom, the sensory deprivation, the lack of meaningful interaction, the constant exposure to suffering, all these elements combine to create an environment that would break even the strongest spirit. You realize with a chilling clarity that this is not a place of healing, but a place of containment, a living tomb where the vibrant colors of life slowly fade to institutional gray. The misery isn't just a fleeting emotion, it's a pervasive atmosphere, a constant companion that settles deep into your bones and your very soul. And you, experiencing this in your mind's eye, feel the oppressive weight of that existence, a burden almost too heavy to bear. You've settled, if one can call it that, into the soul-crushing routine of the ward. Now imagine the treatments that await you, or that you witness being inflicted upon others. Forget the carefully calibrated pharmacopoeia and nuanced psychotherapies of your modern era. In the Victorian asylum, the understanding of the brain was rudimentary, and the methods employed were often born of desperation, ignorance, and a chilling belief in the need to shock the mind back to sanity, or at the very least, to subdue and control the unruly patient. You are acutely aware that any deviation from the expected behavior, any outburst of distress, any perceived act of defiance, could mark you for one of these terrifying interventions. The fear of these treatments is a constant, gnawing anxiety, a shadow that hangs over every interaction, every moment of your waking life. One of the most common and enduring therapies was the use of hydrotherapy, but not in the relaxing, spa-like sense you might envision. This was often extreme. You might be subjected to prolonged immersion in icy cold water, sometimes for hours, in the belief that the shock to your system would calm your agitated nerves or purge the madness from your brain. Imagine being forced into a bath of frigid water, your body convulsing with shivers, your teeth chattering uncontrollably, your breath catching in your throat, while attendants stand by impassive. The cold penetrates to your very core, a searing, painful sensation that feels less like a cure and more like a punishment. Or, conversely, you might be placed in a bath of scalding hot water, the steam rising around you, your skin turning red and inflamed, your body aching with the heat. The intention was to induce a fever, to sweat out the toxins believed to cause mental illness. Neither extreme offers comfort. Both offer profound discomfort and a deep sense of violation. You are not a person receiving care. You are an object being manipulated, a body to be shocked into submission. Then there's the mechanical restraint, a topic we'll delve deeper into, but which also falls under the umbrella of treatment. Straitjackets, manacles, leg irons, restraint chairs, these weren't merely for containment but were often seen as therapeutic. The idea was that by immobilizing the body, you could somehow calm the mind. Imagine being trussed up, your limbs bound tightly, unable to move, unable to defend yourself, your muscles aching, your circulation impaired. The feeling of utter helplessness, of being completely at the mercy of your captors, is a profound psychological trauma. You might struggle initially, your panic rising, only to find that your struggles only tighten the bonds, making your discomfort even greater. The loss of bodily autonomy is absolute, and the psychological impact of such an experience, the feeling of being caged and rendered powerless, is something that would scar you deeply, perhaps irrevocably. Pharmacological interventions were also present, though vastly different from today's precision medicines. Opium, cannabis, alcohol, and various potent sedatives were often administered, not with a precise understanding of their effects on the brain, but primarily to subdue unruly patients and maintain order on the wards. Imagine being given a draft that plunges you into a deep, dreamless sleep, or leaves you in a stupor, your mind foggy, your body heavy and unresponsive. You lose control not just of your actions but of your very consciousness. These substances, often given in crude, unregulated doses, could have severe side effects, leading to addiction, long-term physical damage, or even death. You might see fellow patients become perpetually drowsy, their eyes glazed over, their movements sluggish, their personalities dulled by the constant chemical suppression. The aim wasn't to restore your mental faculties, but to render you quiescent, docile, and manageable. Your modern understanding of carefully controlled dosages and targeted treatments makes this approach seem barbaric, a chemical bludgeon rather than a healing balm. Beyond these, there were even more extreme and frankly terrifying methods. The rotating chair, or centrifugal machine, was a device intended to induce dizziness and nausea, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness, in the belief that this physical disorientation could reset a disordered mind. Imagine being strapped into a chair that spins you at high speeds, the world blurring around you, your stomach churning, your head pounding, the sensation of gravity pulling at your insides. The sheer terror of being subjected to such a device, the feeling of losing control of your body in such a violent way, would be utterly horrifying. Another crude treatment involved inducing seizures, sometimes electrically, long before the development of modern electroconvulsive therapy, which, while still controversial, is a vastly more refined and controlled procedure. The raw, unfiltered application of electricity, without anesthesia or proper monitoring, would have been a profoundly traumatic and dangerous experience. The underlying philosophy behind many of these treatments was a blend of moral judgment and misguided physiological theory. Madness was often seen as a moral failing, a sign of weakness or sin, and thus harsh methods were justified as a means of correcting the patient's will or purging their moral corruption. Simultaneously, there was a belief that the brain was a physical organ that could be shocked, purged, or rebalanced through extreme physical means. The concept of talking therapy, of exploring the patient's inner world, was largely absent, seen as unscientific or ineffective. You, as a patient, are not asked about your feelings, your experiences, your suffering. Instead, your body is the battlefield, and your mind is the enemy to be conquered through physical means. This absence of psychological engagement, this complete disregard for your internal landscape, is perhaps one of the most profound horrors. You might witness these treatments being administered to others. The screams, the struggles, the desperate pleas of a fellow patient being dragged to a cold bath or strapped into a restraint chair would echo through the wards, a constant, chilling reminder of what could await you. The sight of another human being subjected to such indignity and pain, powerless and terrified, would leave an indelible mark on your soul. You would learn to dread the sound of approaching footsteps, the sight of an attendant carrying a particular piece of equipment, the sudden opening of a door that signals someone is about to be taken away for a treatment. The atmosphere of fear this creates is palpable, a pervasive anxiety that infiltrates every corner of the institution. The lasting effects of these brutal interventions are manifold. Physically, patients could suffer from hypothermia, burns, lacerations, broken bones from struggling against restraints, and the long-term effects of powerful drugs. Psychologically, the trauma would be immense. The constant fear, the feeling of being violated, the loss of agency, the profound dehumanization. These would undoubtedly exacerbate any existing mental distress and create new, deep-seated psychological wounds. Many patients emerge from these treatments not cured but broken, subdued, and utterly defeated, their spirits crushed, their minds perhaps even more clouded by the trauma they endured. The irony, the tragic irony, is that these interventions intended to restore sanity often drove patients further into the depths of despair and psychosis. You, with your modern understanding of trauma-informed care and patient rights, would look upon these practices with horror and a profound sense of sorrow for the countless lives that were not only left untreated but actively harmed by the very institutions meant to heal them. This is not healing. This is a brutal, misguided attempt at control, leaving scars far deeper than the eye can see. The specter of restraint hangs heavy in the air of the Victorian asylum, a constant, chilling threat. You quickly learn that your body is not your own, and any perceived lack of control, any deviation from the expected docility, can lead to your physical freedom being brutally curtailed. Forget the modern principle of minimal restraint, used only in extreme emergencies and for the shortest possible duration, under strict medical supervision. Here, restraint is a tool of routine management, a means of controlling behavior, preventing self-harm or harm to others, and simply making the lives of overworked staff easier. It is a pervasive, ever-present reality, and the fear of it is a powerful, silent enforcer of conformity. Imagine yourself or a fellow patient becoming agitated. Perhaps you are crying inconsolably or pacing restlessly, or attempting to communicate something that the attendants deem disruptive. The response is swift and often brutal. You might be seized by several attendants, your protests ignored or dismissed as further evidence of your madness. Your limbs are then bound. This could be with a straitjacket, a canvas garment that binds your arms tightly across your chest, making movement impossible. The fabric is coarse, scratchy, and quickly becomes stifling. Your chest feels constricted, your breathing shallow. The feeling of being trapped within your own body, unable to use your hands, unable to gesticulate, unable to even scratch an itch, is a profound and terrifying loss of control. Your modern understanding of the psychological need for movement, for self-expression through gesture, makes this forced stillness feel like a living death. Beyond straitjackets, there were other, even more crude and painful forms of mechanical restraint. Leather straps were commonly used to bind wrists and ankles to the sides of beds, to chairs, or even directly to the wall. Imagine the chafing of the leather against your skin, the raw red marks that quickly appear, the constant ache in your muscles as your body strains against the unyielding bonds. You might be left in such a position for hours, even days, your limbs stiffening, your circulation impeded, your bladder and bowels left unattended. The indignity of being forced to lie in your own waste, unable to clean yourself, is a profound assault on your dignity and humanity. You yearn for the simple freedom to shift your weight, to stretch your limbs, to attend to your basic bodily needs, but these are luxuries denied. Sometimes, more severe forms of restraint were employed. Iron manacles and leg irons, reminiscent of those used for criminals, were not uncommon, particularly for patients deemed violent or prone to escape. Imagine the heavy, cold metal clamped around your wrists and ankles, the clinking sound they make with every slight movement, a constant, audible reminder of your captivity. These were not designed for comfort, but for absolute immobility. The weight of the chains, the pressure they exert on your flesh, the constant threat of injury if you struggle too hard, these are physical torments. But the psychological torment is perhaps even greater. The feeling of being treated not as a sick person but as a dangerous animal, a criminal to be shackled. Your modern mind, which sees mental illness as a medical condition requiring compassionate care, would recoil from this dehumanizing spectacle. The restraint chair, was another terrifying device. These were often heavy, sturdy chairs, sometimes with a locking mechanism, to which patients could be strapped for prolonged periods. Imagine being forced into such a chair, your body rigidly held, unable to lean back, unable to shift position, your muscles screaming in protest. The world shrinks to the immediate confines of the chair, and the hours crawl by with agonizing slowness. You are left there, often in a communal area, exposed to the gaze of others, a public spectacle of your own helplessness. The humiliation is immense, the feeling of being utterly objectified, stripped of all agency. Beyond mechanical restraints, there was the ultimate form of confinement, the padded cell or solitary room. These were small, often windowless rooms, sometimes with padded walls, though often just bare, cold stone or brick, designed for complete isolation. Imagine being thrust into such a space, the heavy door clanging shut behind you, plunging you into near total darkness and silence. The absence of light, of sound, of human contact, would be a profound sensory deprivation. Your mind, already fragile, would be left to its own devices, to churn through its anxieties, its delusions, its fears, with no external distraction, no human connection to anchor it to reality. The silence, initially perhaps a relief from the cacophony of the ward, would quickly become oppressive, amplifying every internal thought, every whisper of your own mind, until it feels as though the walls are closing in. The purpose of these solitary cells was ostensibly to calm agitated patients or to prevent them from harming themselves or others. But the reality was often one of profound neglect and further psychological damage. Patients could be left in these cells for hours, days, or even weeks, sometimes with minimal food or water, and often with no sanitation facilities beyond a bucket. The feeling of being utterly forgotten, of having your existence erased from the world, would be a form of psychological torture. Your modern understanding of the devastating impact of solitary confinement on mental health makes these practices seem not just cruel, but counterproductive to any genuine therapeutic goal. The consequences of prolonged restraint and confinement were devastating. Physically, patients suffered from bedsores, muscle atrophy, nerve damage, impaired circulation, and increased susceptibility to infection. Deaths from strangulation in straitjackets or from exhaustion due to struggling against restraints were not uncommon. Psychologically, the trauma was immense. Patients often emerged from restraint more withdrawn, more agitated, more deeply traumatized than before. They learned helplessness, their spirits broken, their will to resist extinguished. The experience instilled a deep-seated fear and distrust of their caregivers, making any therapeutic relationship impossible. You watching this unfold or imagining yourself in such a predicament would feel a profound sense of injustice and horror. The very institutions meant to provide care were often places where human dignity was systematically dismantled, where bodies were controlled and minds were broken. The chains and cells, the straitjackets and straps, are not just historical artifacts. They are potent symbols of a time when fear, ignorance, and a lack of compassion governed the treatment of the mentally ill. The stark contrast with your own era, where personal liberty and human rights are paramount, makes the brutality of these practices even more chilling. You realize that in the Victorian asylum, sanity was not just a state of mind, but a fragile privilege easily lost and brutally punished if it dared to waver. The clinking of chains, the creak of a heavy door, the rustle of a straitjacket. These sounds would become the chilling soundtrack to a life defined by unending confinement that you felt the pervasive chill of the asylum, the monotony of the wards, and the terror of the treatments. Now let's turn our gaze to the most basic human needs: food and cleanliness. In your modern world, you take for granted access to nutritious, varied food, clean water, and private hygienic sanitation facilities. In the Victorian asylum, these were not rights, but often grudgingly provided necessities, frequently inadequate and contributing significantly to the misery and ill health of the patients. The struggle for basic sustenance and dignity was a constant, underlying current of daily life. Consider the diet. As mentioned before, meals were meager. Breakfast might be a thin gruel or porridge, often watery and lacking in substance, accompanied by a piece of hard, stale bread and weak, unsweetened tea. Lunch and dinner would follow a similar pattern. Perhaps a small portion of boiled meat, often gristly and tough, boiled potatoes and some form of overcooked, bland vegetable. Variety was almost non-existent. The food was often prepared in bulk, with little attention to flavor or nutritional value, and served cold or lukewarm. Imagine the sheer lack of pleasure in eating, the constant dull ache of hunger that never quite goes away, the body yearning for proper nourishment. Your modern diet, with its abundance of fresh produce, lean proteins and diverse flavors, stands in stark contrast to this grim reality. You would quickly feel the effects of such a diet: a constant feeling of weakness, a lack of energy, a dullness of mind, and an increased susceptibility to illness. Malnutrition was a pervasive problem, subtly but relentlessly eroding the health and vitality of the patients. The conditions of the dining halls themselves added to the unpleasantness. They were often overcrowded, noisy, and chaotic. Patients, some with severe behavioral issues, would eat together, sometimes grabbing at food, spilling it, or making strange noises. The atmosphere was anything but conducive to a pleasant meal. You might find yourself trying to eat quickly to avoid drawing attention, to simply get through the ordeal. The utensils, if provided, might be crude, or patients might be forced to eat with their hands. The lack of dignity surrounding this most basic human act was another form of dehumanization, a constant reminder that you were not considered worthy of even the simplest comforts. Now let's confront the issue of sanitation, a truly grim aspect of asylum life. The sheer number of people confined in often overcrowded wards, combined with a rudimentary understanding of hygiene and limited resources, created an environment ripe for disease and profound discomfort. In many asylums, particularly the larger public ones, there were simply not enough toilets or washing facilities for the number of patients. Imagine communal latrines, often open, with inadequate flushing mechanisms, or simply chamber pots that were not emptied frequently enough. The stench would be pervasive, a heavy, sickening odor that permeated the air, clinging to clothing and skin. Your modern sense of personal hygiene, your expectation of clean, private bathrooms, would be utterly shattered by this reality. Personal cleanliness was a constant struggle. Patients might be allowed to wash only infrequently, perhaps once a week, often in cold, communal baths with harsh soap and shared towels. For those who were incontinent or too ill or withdrawn to care for themselves, the situation was even more dire. They might lie in soiled clothing or bedding for extended periods, leading to skin infections, bedsores, and a general state of squalor. The attendants, often overwhelmed and underpaid, simply did not have the time or resources to provide individual, dignified care for every patient. The sight of unwashed bodies, matted hair, and neglected skin would be a common, distressing sight. You would feel the grime on your own skin, the stickiness, the itch, and the profound shame of being unable to maintain your own cleanliness. The bedding was often coarse, thin, and infrequently changed. Mattresses might be straw-filled, quickly becoming lumpy, damp, and infested with vermin. Imagine trying to sleep on such a bed, feeling the scratch of straw, the dampness, the constant itch of fleas or lice. Sleep, already difficult due to the noise and anxiety of the ward, would be made even more elusive by the physical discomfort and the psychological distress of living in such unsanitary conditions. The lack of clean, comfortable bedding is another subtle but powerful erosion of human dignity. Overcrowding exacerbated all these problems. When wards were packed far beyond their intended capacity, the air became stale and heavy, the spread of infectious diseases rampant. Tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus. These were common scourges in Victorian asylums, often sweeping through the patient population with devastating effect. The very environment, intended to provide care, became a breeding ground for illness, a silent killer claiming lives that might have been saved with proper hygiene and nutrition. You would live with the constant threat of infection, knowing that a cough from a fellow patient, a shared utensil, or simply the pervasive uncleanliness could lead to your own physical decline. The contrast with your modern understanding of infection control, of public health standards, of the importance of clean water and sanitation, is profound. You live in a world where these things are largely guaranteed, where the risk of contracting a serious illness from your living environment is minimal. In the Victorian asylum, that risk was ever present, a silent, unseen enemy that added another layer of fear and suffering to an already grim existence. The sheer physical discomfort, the constant assault on your senses by foul odors, the persistent feeling of being unclean, and the gnawing hunger, these were not incidental hardships, but fundamental, inescapable realities of life within the asylum walls. They wore down the body as relentlessly as the monotony wore down the mind, leaving patients weakened, vulnerable, and utterly miserable. You realize that the horrors of the asylum weren't just about overt cruelty, but also about the systematic denial of basic human needs, a slow, grinding attrition of body and spirit. Segment 7. The staff, custodians of despair. You've seen the wards, felt the fear of treatment, and tasted the meager rations. Now let's consider the figures who hold the keys, who enforce the rules, and who are your primary point of contact with this terrifying reality: the staff. Forget the highly trained, empathetic mental health professionals of your modern hospitals. In the Victorian asylum, the term staff encompasses a wide spectrum of individuals, from the superintendent at the top to the lowliest attendant, and their roles, motivations, and impact on your life vary wildly, but rarely offer true comfort or genuine care. They are, in many ways, the custodians of despair, maintaining the structure of this oppressive world. At the very top, you have the medical superintendent, a figure of immense authority. He is often a physician, sometimes pioneering in his own right, but his knowledge of mental illness is still rooted in the limited science of the era. He is responsible for the overall running of the asylum, its finances, its reputation, and the cure rates of its patients. He might conduct rounds, a fleeting presence in your ward, his gaze distant, his pronouncements clinical. You might yearn for his attention, for a moment of genuine medical insight, but he is often detached, burdened by administrative duties, and perhaps hardened by the sheer scale of suffering he oversees. His decisions, however, carry immense weight, determining your fate, your treatment, your very existence within these walls. You are acutely aware that your future rests in his hands, yet he remains an almost mythical, unreachable figure. Below him are the nurses, though the term nurse in the Victorian asylum often meant something different than your modern understanding. These were typically women, often from working-class backgrounds with little formal medical training. Their role was primarily supervisory, administering basic care, keeping records, and ensuring the smooth running of the wards. Some might possess a genuine spark of compassion, a quiet kindness that offers a momentary respite from the harshness. But many are overwhelmed, weary, or simply hardened by the daily grind. They are caught between the demands of the superintendent and the intractable realities of their patients. You might find yourself seeking their gaze, hoping for a flicker of understanding, but often you are met with a practiced indifference, a defense mechanism against the constant onslaught of human suffering. The most numerous and often the most directly impactful on your daily life are the attendants. These are the men and women who spend the most time on the wards, directly supervising patients, enforcing rules, and carrying out the more unpleasant tasks. Their pay is often low, their hours long, and their training minimal. Many are recruited from the ranks of the working poor, desperate for employment, and possess no particular aptitude or empathy for the mentally ill. Imagine the kind of person drawn to such a job. Some might be genuinely kind-hearted, attempting to offer what solace they can, but others might be rough, impatient, or even sadistic. The power imbalance is enormous. You, as a patient, are utterly at their mercy. The attendants are the ones who enforce the routine, who distribute the meager food, who oversee the communal washing, who administer the treatments, and crucially who apply the restraints. Their authority is absolute, backed by the institutional power of the asylum. A harsh word from an attendant, a dismissive gesture, or a subtle threat can send a wave of fear through the ward. You learn to walk on eggshells around them, to anticipate their moods, to avoid anything that might provoke their ire. The fear isn't just of physical punishment, though that is a very real possibility. It's also the fear of being singled out, of being subjected to extra indignities, of having your already meager comforts further curtailed. Cases of attendant brutality were disturbingly common. Striking patients, verbally abusing them, neglecting their basic needs, or even sexually assaulting them were dark secrets within many asylums. The isolation of these institutions, the lack of external oversight, and the voicelessness of the patients created an environment where such abuses could flourish unchecked. If you were to complain, who would listen? Your words would be dismissed as the ravings of a mad person, while the attendant's word would be taken as gospel. The profound injustice of this situation is chilling. You are trapped, utterly powerless, and your only recourse is silence and submission. The psychological toll on the staff themselves must also have been immense. Constantly surrounded by profound suffering, exposed to violence, disease, and the bizarre manifestations of mental illness, without adequate training, support, or therapeutic outlets, many attendants undoubtedly became hardened, cynical, or even traumatized themselves. The job was emotionally draining, physically demanding, and often thankless. This doesn't excuse cruelty, but it helps to explain the pervasive atmosphere of indifference and occasional brutality. The line between care and custody was often blurred, with custodial duties frequently taking precedence. The lack of specialized training for mental health care is a stark contrast to your modern world. Today, nurses and therapists undergo years of education, learning about various mental illnesses, therapeutic techniques, and ethical patient care. In the Victorian asylum, an attendant might be hired with no more qualification than physical strength and a willingness to work for low wages. Their understanding of the complex human mind was often limited to popular prejudices and anecdotal observations, leading to misinterpretations of symptoms and the application of inappropriate, harmful interventions. You, as a patient, witnessed the spectrum of staff behavior. You learn to distinguish between the rare kind attendant who might offer a quiet word of comfort or a small act of mercy, and the many who are indifferent, harsh, or outright cruel. Your hopes become tethered to these small acts of kindness, these fleeting moments of humanity, knowing they are rare and precious. The staff are not just individuals. They are the embodiment of the institution's power, its indifference, and its occasional flashes of misguided care. They are the gatekeepers to your freedom, the administrators of your daily suffering, and the constant, inescapable presence in your confined world. Their faces, their voices, their movements become etched into your memory, a permanent part of the nightmare you inhabit. And you, observing their actions, feel the chilling weight of their authority, and the desperate vulnerability of those subjected to it. You are one of them now, a patient, an inmate, a lunatic. But who are these people who share your confinement, who populate the wards with their myriad forms of suffering? Forget the simplistic, often caricatured portrayals of madmen from popular fiction. The reality of the Victorian asylum was a gallery of misunderstood souls, a tragic collection of individuals whose struggles were profound, varied, and often exacerbated by the very environment meant to contain them. Their stories, often untold and unheard, are the true heart of the asylum's horror. You are surrounded by people suffering from conditions that today we would recognize as severe mental illnesses: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, dementia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. But in this era, these distinctions are largely unknown or ignored. Instead, their symptoms are lumped together under broad, terrifying labels like mania, melancholia, dementia praecox, or general paralysis of the insane. You see the man who mutters incessantly to himself, his eyes wide with an unseen terror, convinced that invisible forces are conspiring against him. Today you might recognize the signs of paranoid schizophrenia, a complex neurobiological disorder. Then he is simply delusional, a dangerous eccentric to be subdued. You observe the woman who sits motionless for hours, staring vacantly into space, unresponsive to stimuli, her face utterly devoid of expression. She might occasionally let out a soft moan or a sudden, unexpected cry. In your time, you'd suspect severe depression or catatonia, requiring careful psychiatric intervention. Here she is merely melancholic, a burden, a body to be kept alive, her inner world utterly impenetrable and disregarded. You see her and feel a profound sadness, a yearning to reach out, to understand, but you know that such an attempt would likely be futile, and possibly even draw unwanted attention to yourself. There are those whose behavior is agitated, restless, prone to sudden outbursts of shouting, laughter, or tears. They might pace endlessly, unable to sit still, their minds seemingly racing at an unbearable speed. You might recognize the manic phase of bipolar disorder, a powerful surge of energy and disordered thought. In the asylum they are simply maniacal, a threat to order, a disruptive force to be sedated or restrained. Their vibrant, chaotic energy, though born of suffering, is perceived as a defiance to be crushed. You witness their struggles, their desperate attempts to communicate a reality that is utterly inaccessible to others, and you feel a chilling echo of your own potential loss of control. Many patients suffer from the ravages of physical diseases that affect the brain, such as syphilis, which often led to general paralysis of the insane, tuberculosis, or various forms of dementia. You see the elderly man whose memory is gone, whose speech is slurred, whose body is frail and trembling. He is lost in a world of his own making, often confused and disoriented. He is simply demented, awaiting a slow, inevitable decline, his dignity gradually stripped away by the disease and the institutional neglect. You glimpse the raw vulnerability of human aging, unsoftened by the compassionate care and understanding that would be afforded to him in your era. A significant number of patients are women, often committed for reasons that seem absurd by modern standards: hysteria, nervousness, postpartum depression, misunderstood and pathologized, or even insubordination to their husbands. You see young women, vibrant and intelligent, now subdued and listless, their spirits broken by the confinement and the systematic invalidation of their experiences. Their madness often stems from societal pressures, gender expectations, and the profound lack of agency afforded to women in Victorian society. Their presence is a stark reminder of how social control could be disguised as medical intervention, particularly for those who dare to step outside their prescribed roles. Children, too, are present, a truly heartbreaking sight. They might suffer from developmental disabilities, autism, epilepsy, or severe trauma. But in an era without proper diagnoses or educational support, they are simply labeled idiots or imbeciles, confined alongside adults, often neglected or abused. You see their small, bewildered faces, their innocent eyes reflecting a profound confusion and fear, and your heart aches for their lost childhoods, their stolen futures. The presence of children, so vulnerable and so utterly dependent on compassionate care, in such a brutal environment, is perhaps one of the most profound horrors you witness. The profound tragedy is that many of these individuals, with proper diagnosis, compassionate care, and therapeutic intervention, could have led fulfilling lives outside the asylum walls. Instead, they are trapped in a cycle of misunderstanding, neglect, and brutality, their conditions often exacerbated by the very environment meant to cure them. The constant exposure to other patients' suffering, the lack of stimulation, the dehumanizing routine, the fear of punishment, all these factors contribute to a deepening of their mental distress. Many patients who entered the asylum with treatable conditions emerged, if they emerged at all, as chronic inmates, their personalities dulled, their spirits crushed, their sanity perhaps truly lost within the institutional walls. You observe them, these fellow sufferers, and you realize that they are not inherently mad in the way society defines them. They are human beings, complex and individual, wrestling with profound internal struggles in an environment utterly unequipped to understand or alleviate their pain. They are victims of their time, of societal ignorance, of medical limitations, and of institutional indifference. Their vacant stares, their agitated movements, their incoherent mutterings, these are not just symptoms. They are desperate cries for help, reflections of fractured minds, echoes of lost lives. And as you walk among them, you feel a chilling sense of solidarity, a horrifying realization that their fate could so easily be your own, that the line between us and them is terrifyingly thin, and often drawn by nothing more than circumstance and societal prejudice. They are the living embodiment of the asylum's true horror, a constant, poignant reminder of humanity's capacity for both suffering and profound neglect. That you've absorbed the grim realities of asylum life, the endless monotony, the brutal treatments, the varied suffering of your fellow patients. Now, let's peel back a layer of historical narrative to examine something called moral treatment. In your modern understanding, the term moral often implies ethical or virtuous conduct. In the Victorian context of asylum reform, moral treatment was initially heralded as a compassionate, enlightened approach, a radical departure from the chains and dungeons of earlier eras. It promised kindness, routine, purposeful activity, and a focus on the individual. But as you experience the asylum firsthand, you quickly realize that for many, this moral treatment was often a veneer, a facade of benevolence that barely concealed the underlying realities of control, discipline, and profound institutional neglect. The theory behind moral treatment, pioneered by figures like William Tuke in England and Philippe Pinel in France, was revolutionary for its time. It proposed that mental illness was not always a demonic possession or an incurable affliction, but could be influenced by a patient's environment and moral character. The idea was to treat patients with respect, engage them in meaningful work, provide a structured routine, encourage self-control, and offer a calming, supportive atmosphere. Instead of chains, there would be kindness. Instead of idleness, there would be productive labor. Instead of fear, there would be moral persuasion. On paper, it sounded like a beacon of hope, a truly humane approach. However, as the Victorian era progressed and asylums grew in size and number, the practical application of moral treatment often faltered, diluted by economic pressures, overcrowding, and a fundamental misunderstanding of complex mental illnesses. Imagine yourself in an asylum that claims to practice moral treatment. You might indeed find some elements of it, perhaps a more organized routine than the utter chaos of earlier institutions, perhaps some opportunities for occupational therapy, like gardening or laundry work. The attendants might be instructed to be less overtly brutal, to use persuasion rather than immediate physical force. You might even experience moments of relative calm, a fleeting sense that you are being treated with a semblance of humanity. But beneath this surface, the core principles of control and discipline remained paramount. The kindness was often conditional, contingent on your conformity. Any deviation from the prescribed behavior, any outburst, any sign of resistance, could quickly negate the moral aspect of the treatment. The respect often meant treating you like a wayward child, to be gently guided but firmly corrected. You are expected to internalize the asylum's rules, to become self-disciplined, to exhibit rational behavior. If you fail to do so, the veneer of kindness quickly peels away, revealing the harsh underlying structure of institutional power. The meaningful work often devolved into unpaid labor for the benefit of the asylum. Patients would spend hours in the laundries, kitchens, farms, or workshops, contributing significantly to the institution's self-sufficiency. While some might find a brief sense of purpose in these tasks, for many, it was simply another form of exploitation, a way to keep them busy and productive without offering genuine therapeutic benefit or fair compensation. You might find yourself exhausted at the end of the day, your body aching, your spirit no more uplifted than if you had been idle. The idea that this labor was inherently therapeutic, rather than simply cost-saving, often felt like a cruel deception. Moreover, the sheer scale of the Victorian asylums made genuine individual attention, a cornerstone of moral treatment, almost impossible. As institutions grew from small, intimate retreats to massive, impersonal complexes housing hundreds or even thousands of patients, the ratio of staff to patients plummeted. How could an attendant, responsible for dozens of agitated, distressed individuals, offer personalized care, moral guidance, or empathetic understanding? The ideals of moral treatment simply could not scale. You, as one among hundreds, would quickly realize that you are just a number, your individual needs lost in the vast machinery of the institution. The underlying moralistic judgment also remained. Mental illness was still often perceived as a defect of character or a failure of will. If you didn't improve, if you didn't respond to the moral persuasion, it was often interpreted as a sign of your recalcitrance, your inherent depravity, rather than the intractable nature of your illness or the inadequacy of the treatment. This placed an immense psychological burden on you, the patient. You were not just sick, you were morally failing. This internalization of blame, this feeling of being responsible for your own madness, was a profound additional layer of suffering. Consider the physical environment. While moral treatment advocated for pleasant surroundings, many asylums, even those claiming to follow its principles, were still stark, utilitarian, and devoid of genuine comfort or beauty. The high walls, the barred windows, the institutional smells, the lack of privacy, these realities persisted. A fresh coat of paint or a well-tended garden might provide a superficial improvement, but they could not erase the fundamental sense of imprisonment and dehumanization. You might walk in the exercise yard, breathing in the fresh air, but the high walls and the watchful eyes of attendants would be a constant reminder that you are still a captive, not a guest. So, while the concept of moral treatment represented a significant step forward in the history of mental health care, its practical implementation in the vast, overcrowded Victorian asylums often fell short of its noble ideals. For many patients, it was a hollow promise, a veneer of kindness that barely disguised the underlying realities of control, discipline, and profound institutional neglect. It was a shift from overt brutality to a more subtle, psychological form of control, often equally damaging to the human spirit. You, discerning the reality behind the rhetoric, would feel a profound sense of disillusionment, recognizing that even the most enlightened approaches of the era were still deeply flawed, trapped by ignorance, prejudice, and the overwhelming challenges of caring for so many misunderstood souls. The moral aspect often felt more like moralizing, a constant judgment rather than genuine therapeutic support. That you've navigated the physical world of the Victorian asylum, enduring its gates, its wards, its treatments, its staff, and its hollow promises. Now let's delve into the most profound and terrifying horror of all, the psychological toll. What happens to your mind, your very sense of self, when you are stripped of your identity, your autonomy, your connections, and plunged into an environment designed for control rather than healing? The impact is devastating, a slow, insidious erosion of the spirit that can be far more damaging than any physical restraint. Imagine the constant, gnawing anxiety. You live in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing what the next hour will bring, what new rule will be enforced, what attendance mood will shift, what treatment might be ordered. Your modern life, with its predictable routines and personal control, offers a sense of security. Here, that security is utterly absent. Every interaction is fraught with potential danger, every decision made by someone else, every moment a potential trigger for punishment or further confinement. This ceaseless state of hypervigilance would wear down your nervous system, leaving you constantly on edge, unable to relax, unable to find peace even in the brief moments of quiet. Your heart might race, your hands might tremble, your breath might come in shallow gasps, even when there is no immediate threat, simply because the potential for threat is always present. Then there's the profound sense of powerlessness. You have no control over your schedule, your food, your clothing, your movements, your interactions, or even your own body. Your protests are ignored, your pleas dismissed, your sanity questioned. This utter lack of agency is profoundly dehumanizing. You are reduced to a passive object, acted upon by others, rather than an active subject capable of making choices. This learned helplessness, the realization that nothing you do matters, that your will is utterly irrelevant, is a crushing weight on the spirit. It can lead to a profound apathy, a surrender of the self, where resistance feels futile and hope becomes a dangerous illusion. You might stop trying to articulate your thoughts, stop trying to assert your needs, simply because you've learned that it makes no difference or worse, invites negative consequences. The loss of identity is another insidious horror. Your name is replaced by a number or a generic label. Your personal belongings are gone. Your clothes are uniform. Your past life, your relationships, your achievements, these are all irrelevant within the asylum walls. You are no longer a parent, a spouse, a professional, an artist, a scholar. You are simply a patient. This systematic erasure of your former self can lead to a profound identity crisis. Who are you if not the person you once were? And if no one recognizes that person, if everyone insists you are someone else, someone mad, someone broken, how long can you hold on to your own sense of self? The mirror reflects not just your physical deterioration, but the erosion of your very essence, a stranger staring back at you. The constant exposure to the suffering of others is also deeply traumatizing. You are surrounded by people in various states of distress, many of whom are far sicker than you, and their pain becomes your daily reality. The screams, the moans, the vacant stares, the agitated movements, the incoherent ramblings, these sounds and sights are a constant assault on your senses and your empathy. You might try to wall yourself off to become numb to it, but the sheer volume of suffering is inescapable. It breeds a pervasive sense of despair, a feeling that there is no escape, that this misery is the universal condition within these walls. Your own anxieties are amplified by the collective anguish, creating a feedback loop of fear and hopelessness. Social isolation, even amidst a crowd, is another devastating factor. While you are physically surrounded by people, there is often little genuine connection or meaningful interaction. Communication is difficult, either because fellow patients are too unwell, or because you learn to fear drawing attention to yourself. The staff are often distant or indifferent. This profound loneliness, this lack of human understanding and empathy, can be incredibly damaging. Humans are social creatures wired for connection. To be deprived of it, to feel utterly alone in your suffering, is a form of psychological torture that can drive even the most resilient mind further into isolation and despair. You crave a kind word, a sympathetic glance, a moment of shared humanity, but these are rare oases in a vast desert of solitude. Then there's the pervasive sense of injustice and shame. You might know deep down that you don't belong here, that your commitment was a mistake, or that your struggles are being profoundly misunderstood. Yet your protests are dismissed and your voice is silenced. This profound injustice can lead to overwhelming feelings of anger, frustration, and bitterness, which, if expressed, are often interpreted as further evidence of your madness. You are forced to internalize these feelings, to suppress them, which only adds to the psychological burden. The shame of being labeled mad, of being confined in an asylum, is immense, a stain on your reputation that would follow you even if you were to eventually be released. This internalized stigma can lead to a profound self-loathing, a belief that you are indeed broken, unworthy, and deserving of your fate. The lack of mental stimulation and purpose, as discussed earlier, also takes a heavy toll. The human mind thrives on challenge, on learning, on creativity, on meaningful engagement. To be deprived of these, to be left with hours of enforced idleness, allows your mind to turn inward, to ruminate on anxieties, to create its own internal world, which can sometimes deepen existing delusions or create new ones. Your memories might become distorted, your sense of time blurred, your grip on reality tenuous. The very fabric of your thought processes begins to fray under the relentless pressure of boredom and confinement. Ultimately, the psychological toll of the Victorian asylum is one of profound trauma. It is a place where minds are not healed but often further broken, where spirits are not uplifted but systematically crushed. The cumulative effect of anxiety, powerlessness, identity loss, social isolation, injustice, shame, and mental stagnation creates a crucible of suffering that can leave indelible scars on the human psyche. You, experiencing this harrowing journey, would feel the heavy, suffocating weight of this psychological burden, a terror far deeper than any physical discomfort, for it threatens to steal not just your life, but your very soul, leaving behind only an empty shell. The silence of your own mind, once a sanctuary, becomes a terrifying echo chamber for your deepest fears. You've been immersed in the psychological torment of the asylum, the erosion of your identity, the suffocating monotony. For some, the crushing weight of this existence becomes unbearable, sparking a desperate, primal urge for freedom. In your modern world, if you feel trapped, you have legal avenues, advocates, and the expectation of due process. In the Victorian asylum, with no such recourse, escape became the only perceived pathway to reclaiming one's life. These attempts, though often doomed to failure, are poignant testaments to the enduring human spirit and the profound desperation that defined life within those walls. Imagine the sheer audacity and terror involved in even contemplating escape. You are constantly observed, the walls are high, the windows barred, the doors locked. Every aspect of the asylum's architecture and routine is designed for containment. Yet, the yearning for freedom, the memory of sunlight on your face, the scent of fresh air, the sound of a loved one's voice, these memories become a potent fuel for a desperate plan. You might spend weeks, months, meticulously observing the routines of the attendants, the timing of their rounds, the weaknesses in the building's security. Every small detail becomes a potential key to unlock your prison. The risk is immense, the consequences of failure dire, but the alternative, a life of unending confinement, is even more terrifying. The methods of escape were often rudimentary, born of desperation and limited resources. A patient might try to pick a lock with a stolen piece of wire, or fashion a makeshift tool from a spoon or a piece of metal. Imagine the slow, painstaking work, the constant fear of being discovered, the tremor in your hands as you attempt to manipulate the cold metal in the dead of night. The sounds of the ward, the distant moans, the shuffling footsteps, become amplified, every creak and groan a potential harbinger of discovery. Your heart pounds in your chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence as you work in the shadows, fueled by a desperate, almost animalistic desire for freedom. Others might attempt to scale a wall, perhaps using a discarded blanket or a piece of rope fashioned from torn bedding. Imagine the raw abrasion of brick against your hands, the dizzying height, the risk of a fall, the desperate scramble upwards, your muscles screaming in protest. The cold night air might chill you to the bone, but the adrenaline coursing through your veins would momentarily numb the discomfort. You might glimpse the stars, a vast, open expanse that mocks your confinement, and for a fleeting moment, you feel a surge of hope, a taste of the freedom you crave. But the walls are often too high, too slick, the climb too perilous. Some patients would exploit moments of communal activity, perhaps during an outdoor exercise period or a supervised work detail, to try and slip away. Imagine the sudden sprint, the burst of energy, the desperate dash across an open field, the shouts of the attendants echoing behind you. Your lungs burn, your legs ache, but you push yourself harder, driven by the sheer will to escape. The wind in your hair, the feel of solid ground beneath your feet. These simple sensations become intoxicating, a brief, exhilarating taste of the life you once knew. You might dream of finding your way back to your family, to your home, to the world that has forgotten you. but the reality of escape was often brutal. The vast majority of attempts were unsuccessful. The asylum staff, well versed in the patterns of desperate patients, were often vigilant. The local community, often prejudiced against lunatics, were quick to report any suspicious individuals wandering the countryside. Imagine the crushing disappointment of being recaptured, the despair that washes over you as the familiar faces of the attendants reappear, their expressions a mixture of triumph and grim satisfaction. The brief taste of freedom is snatched away, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste. The consequences of a failed escape attempt were severe. You would likely be subjected to even harsher forms of punishment and restraint. Straitjackets, solitary confinement, prolonged periods in a restraint chair. These would be your immediate future. The treatments would intensify, aimed at breaking your spirit, at teaching you the futility of resistance. Your already meager privileges would be revoked, your movements even more restricted. The psychological impact of failure, of having your desperate hope utterly crushed, would be immense, often driving patients further into despondency or a more profound state of mental distress. The asylum, having reasserted its dominance, would tighten its grip, ensuring that the lesson of your failed attempt served as a chilling deterrent to others. For those who did manage to escape, their freedom was often short-lived and fraught with peril. With no money, no connections, and often disoriented by their illness and the trauma of confinement, they faced a hostile world. They might wander aimlessly, sleeping rough, begging for food, their unusual behavior quickly drawing unwanted attention. The stigma of the asylum followed them like a shadow, making it impossible to blend back into society. They were often quickly identified, recaptured, and returned to the very place they had so desperately tried to flee. The brief glimpse of the outside world, rather than offering salvation, often served only to highlight the impossibility of true freedom. The stories of these escape attempts, whether successful or not, are testaments to the human spirit's innate desire for liberty and dignity. They remind you that even in the most oppressive environments, the spark of hope, however faint, can persist. But they also underscore the profound tragedy of the Victorian asylum, a place where the yearning for freedom was met not with understanding or compassion, but with further punishment and deeper confinement. You realize that the walls of the asylum were not just physical barriers, they were psychological ones designed to break the will, to extinguish the hope, and to ensure that once you entered, you rarely, if ever, truly left. The clanging of those heavy gates, sealing you back inside, would be the most heartbreaking sound imaginable, a final, definitive end to any dreams of a life beyond the walls. You've become accustomed to the grim interior of the asylum, the private horrors unfolding behind its high walls. But now, let's step outside for a moment, not into freedom, but into the curious, often cruel, gaze of the Victorian public. Forget your modern understanding of patient privacy, of medical confidentiality, of the ethical imperative to protect vulnerable individuals. In the Victorian era, particularly in the earlier parts, the mentally ill were sometimes treated as objects of morbid fascination, their suffering a public spectacle, a source of entertainment for the curious masses. This was the era of Bedlam, and its echoes, though perhaps softened, still resonated through the period. Imagine, if you can, a Sunday afternoon outing for a respectable Victorian family. Instead of a stroll in the park or a visit to a museum, they might choose to visit an asylum. Yes, you heard that right. For a small fee, members of the public could gain admittance to institutions like Bethlehem Royal Hospital, famously known as Bedlam, and wander through the wards, observing the lunatics, as if they were animals in a zoo. You, as a patient, would be subjected to this intrusive, dehumanizing gaze. Imagine the feeling of being watched, stared at, pointed at, perhaps even mocked by strangers who view your suffering as a curiosity, a grotesque diversion from their mundane lives. Your modern sensibilities, recoiling from the very idea, cannot fully grasp the profound indignity of such an experience. You are sitting on a bench, perhaps lost in your own thoughts, or muttering to yourself, or simply staring blankly into space. Suddenly, a group of well-dressed men and women, sometimes accompanied by their children, appear at the entrance to your ward. They whisper, they point, some might even laugh. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of fear, disgust, and morbid fascination, rake over your body, assessing your every movement, your every expression. You feel utterly exposed, like an exhibit in a macabre museum. There's no empathy in their gaze, no understanding, just a cold, analytical curiosity, or worse, a smug sense of superiority. You are not a human being with a complex inner world. You are a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a source of cheap entertainment. The attendants, far from protecting your privacy, might even encourage the visitors, perhaps offering a brief, sensationalized explanation of your case, for their amusement. This one thinks he's the Queen of England, they might say with a smirk, or she believes she's made of glass and will shatter if touched. Your personal delusions, your private torment, are stripped bare and presented for public consumption, your dignity utterly annihilated. The feeling of being so profoundly objectified, of having your deepest vulnerabilities exposed to the unfeeling gaze of strangers, would be a form of psychological torture in itself. You might learn to hide, to turn your back, to feign sleep, anything to escape the relentless, dehumanizing scrutiny. This practice, while eventually phased out in its most overt forms by the mid-19th century due to growing calls for reform, left a lasting legacy of stigma and dehumanization. Even after public viewing was abolished, the mentally ill remained figures of fear and fascination in popular culture. Sensationalized newspaper reports, lurid fictional accounts, and public lectures often depicted asylums as places of unspeakable horrors, populated by dangerous, unpredictable madmen. You would be acutely aware of this public perception, knowing that even if you were to be released, the shadow of your confinement, the label of lunatic, would follow you, making it incredibly difficult to reintegrate into society. The public's curiosity was fueled by a potent mix of fear and ignorance. Mental illness was poorly understood, often attributed to moral failings, divine punishment, or simply a lack of self-control. The asylum therefore became a place where these deviants were contained, a stark reminder to the sane public of the precariousness of their own minds and the importance of conforming to societal norms. Viewing the mad served to reinforce the boundaries of normalcy, to reassure the public that they at least were safe from such a fate. Even beyond direct visitation, the architectural presence of the asylum itself fed public curiosity. These grand, often imposing structures, built on the outskirts of towns, were objects of intense speculation. Whispers and rumors about what went on inside their walls circulated freely, often exaggerated and distorted, contributing to the mystique and fear surrounding mental illness. You would feel the weight of these external perceptions, knowing that the outside world viewed your place of confinement not as a hospital, but as a prison for the strange and the terrifying. The contrast with your modern world is striking. Today, mental health campaigns strive to reduce stigma, to promote understanding, to encourage empathy. The idea of parading patients for public amusement is utterly repugnant, a violation of every ethical principle. Yet, in the Victorian era, it was, for a time, an accepted practice, a grim testament to a society grappling with its own anxieties about the human mind. You realize that the horror of the asylum wasn't just internal, it was also the external gaze, the public's morbid curiosity that transformed suffering individuals into mere objects of spectacle, further stripping them of their humanity and dignity. This public spectacle, even in its less overt later forms, ensured that the stigma of the asylum was not just a personal burden, but a societal brand, a mark that could never truly be erased. That you've seen how the asylum system functioned for all. Now, let's sharpen our focus on a particularly vulnerable demographic within these walls: women. In the Victorian era, societal expectations for women were incredibly rigid, placing immense pressure on them to be docile, virtuous, domestic, and emotionally stable. Any deviation from these narrow norms could be interpreted not just as a personality quirk, but as a sign of madness, leading to a unique and often tragic predicament for women within the asylum system. Imagine yourself as a Victorian woman. Your worth is often tied to your role as a wife and mother, your reputation to your respectability. Your emotional life is expected to be carefully controlled, your intellectual pursuits limited. Now, consider what might lead you, specifically, to be committed. It might be hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis that could encompass everything from anxiety and depression to assertiveness, sexual desire, or simply intellectual ambition. A woman who expressed dissatisfaction with her domestic role, who showed too much emotion or not enough, who dared to question her husband's authority, or who simply suffered from profound grief or postpartum depression, could find herself labeled hysterical and deemed in need of institutionalization. The sheer breadth of behaviors deemed hysterical is staggering, revealing how easily female nonconformity could be pathologized. For married women, the husband held significant legal power, often able to commit his wife without her consent and with minimal medical corroboration. Imagine the terror of finding your own spouse, the man who vowed to protect you, signing the papers that condemn you to an asylum. Your protest would be dismissed as further proof of your madness, your pleas for freedom interpreted as delusions. This profound betrayal, this ultimate loss of agency at the hands of the person closest to you, would be a psychological wound far deeper than any physical restraint. You realize that marriage, ostensibly a sanctuary, could become a cage, and the marital bed, a pathway to the asylum. The loss of children was another devastating aspect for women. If a mother was committed, her children were often taken from her, either placed with relatives or sent to orphanages. The grief and anxiety over her lost children, perfectly rational emotions, could then be interpreted by staff as further evidence of her unfitness or delusion, trapping her in a cruel paradox. You can feel the visceral ache of a mother separated from her offspring, the desperate longing, the profound sense of loss, and the added torment of knowing that this anguish is twisted against her as a symptom of her illness. The asylum environment itself presented unique challenges for women. While men's wards were also harsh, women often faced additional layers of vulnerability. They were sometimes subjected to more intrusive treatments related to their reproductive organs, based on the misguided belief that female troubles were the root of their madness. Surgical procedures like ovariotomy, removal of the ovaries, were sometimes performed, a brutal and often ineffective intervention, driven by the belief that women's sexuality and reproductive functions were the source of their mental instability. Imagine the profound violation, the terror of being subjected to such an invasive and unnecessary surgery, your body mutilated in the name of a cure for your mind. Sexual abuse by male attendants was also a horrifying reality for some female patients. Their vulnerability, their lack of voice, and the isolation of the institution made them easy targets. Complaints were often ignored or disbelieved, dismissed as the fantasies of a mad woman. The profound injustice and trauma of such experiences would be unimaginable, leaving deep, unhealing scars. You, with your modern understanding of consent and protection, would recoil from the utter defenselessness of these women. For single women, commitment to an asylum often meant the definitive end of any prospects for marriage or a respectable life. The stigma of having been an asylum inmate was almost impossible to shake, effectively condemning them to a life of social ostracism, even if they were eventually released. Their madness became their defining characteristic, overshadowing any other qualities or potential. You realize that for a Victorian woman, being sent to an asylum was often a death sentence for her social identity, a permanent mark of shame. The very nature of female madness was often seen through a moralistic lens. Women were expected to be pure, pious, and submissive. Any deviation from these ideals, whether through perceived promiscuity, assertiveness, or simply a strong will, could be pathologized. Their madness was often interpreted as a failure of their feminine duties or a moral corruption, rather than a medical condition. This moral judgment added another layer of shame and guilt to their suffering. So, as you reflect on the plight of women in the Victorian asylum, you see a system that was particularly cruel and unjust to them. It was a system that weaponized societal expectations, marital power, and medical ignorance against them, often confining them for behaviors that would today be considered normal, or at worst, understandable emotional responses. Their voices were silenced, their bodies violated, and their identities systematically erased, all under the guise of care. The asylum, for many Victorian women, became a prison where their very womanhood was pathologized, a place where they were punished for daring to be anything other than the idealized, submissive figure society demanded. Their predicament is a stark reminder of how social control and gendered prejudice could intersect with mental health care, creating a truly unique and devastating form of horror. That you've witnessed the various layers of horror within the Victorian asylum, but perhaps the most heartbreaking sight is the presence of children. Forget your modern concept of specialized pediatric care, of child psychology, of inclusive education for those with developmental differences. In the Victorian era, children exhibiting mental, developmental, or behavioral challenges were often deemed idiots, imbeciles, or lunatics, and confined alongside adults in the same brutal institutions. Their innocence, their potential, their very childhoods were systematically stolen, replaced by neglect and despair. Imagine a small child, perhaps no older than 5 or 6, thrust into this terrifying adult world. Their eyes, wide with confusion and fear, dart around the grim ward, taking in the strange, unsettling sights and sounds of adult patients. They might cling to a tattered doll or a scrap of blanket, their only comfort in a place utterly devoid of warmth or familiarity. For a child, whose world is supposed to be one of nurturing, play, and learning, the asylum is a profound distortion of reality, a nightmare from which there is no waking. Your modern heart, accustomed to the protection and special care afforded to children, would ache with an almost unbearable sorrow at this image. Many of these children suffered from what we would today recognize as developmental disabilities like Down syndrome, autism spectrum disorder, or severe learning difficulties. In the Victorian era, these conditions were largely misunderstood, often attributed to moral failings, hereditary taint, or even divine punishment. There was no concept of early intervention, specialized education, or supportive therapies. Instead, these children were seen as inherently defective, beyond help, and thus fit only for institutionalization. They were often referred to with derogatory terms, further stripping them of their humanity. Others might have suffered from severe epilepsy, trauma-induced psychological distress, or early-onset mental illnesses that manifested in childhood. A child prone to seizures, or one who experienced extreme emotional outbursts due to abuse or neglect, could be deemed uncontrollable and institutionalized. Their behaviors, which today would prompt careful medical and psychological assessment, were then simply seen as signs of inherent madness, to be contained. The lack of understanding regarding the unique developmental needs of children meant that their conditions were not only left untreated but often exacerbated by the harsh environment. The wards for children, if separate wards existed at all, were often no less grim than those for adults. They were typically overcrowded, understaffed, and lacking in any stimulating toys, books, or educational materials. Play, a fundamental aspect of childhood development, was often non-existent or severely restricted. Imagine a child growing up in such an environment, starved of intellectual stimulation, emotional connection, and the simple joys of childhood. Their minds, instead of expanding and learning, would often regress, becoming further dulled by the monotony and despair. You realize that this is not just neglect. It is a systematic stunting of a developing human being. Interaction with staff, particularly for children who struggled to communicate, was often minimal and impersonal. Attendants, already overwhelmed by adult patients, had little time or training to cater to the specific needs of children. A child's cries might be ignored, their attempts at communication misunderstood, their needs unmet. Physical and emotional abuse was a very real threat, as vulnerable children were easy targets in an unsupervised environment. The profound loneliness of a child in such a place, craving comfort and connection but finding only indifference or cruelty, is a truly devastating thought. The long-term consequences for these institutionalized children were catastrophic. Many never learned to speak, to read, to write, or to develop basic life skills. They remained dependent on the institution for their entire lives, their potential utterly unrealized. Their physical health often suffered due to malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. Psychologically, they were profoundly traumatized, their emotional development arrested, their capacity for trust and attachment severely damaged. They grew into adults who were often more deeply disturbed than when they first entered, their madness, a product of the institution itself as much as any inherent condition. The sight of a child in the asylum is a stark reminder of the era's profound lack of compassion and scientific understanding. It forces you to confront the utter defenselessness of the most vulnerable members of society when confronted with a system designed for containment rather than care. Your modern world, with its focus on child protection, special education, and early intervention, stands as a stark, humane contrast to this Victorian horror. You feel a profound sense of injustice, an aching sorrow for these lost innocents, whose only crime was to be born with challenges that their society was unwilling or unable to understand and support. Their silent suffering, their bewildered eyes, are perhaps the most poignant and enduring image of the Victorian asylum's cruelty, a testament to childhood stolen and futures forever dimmed. That you've seen the human cost of the Victorian asylum, the suffering of its patients, the struggles of its staff. Now, let's pull back the curtain on a less discussed, but equally insidious aspect: the economic realities, the business of madness. Forget the modern concept of healthcare as a right, funded by public or private insurance, with ethical oversight. In the Victorian era, the care of the mentally ill was deeply intertwined with profit motives, political expediency, and a constant struggle for resources, often leading to profound neglect and exploitation. Consider the private asylums, often called madhouses or lunatic asylums, particularly in the earlier part of the century. These were often run for profit by individuals, sometimes doctors, sometimes not, who saw an opportunity in the growing demand for places to confine the mentally ill. For a fee, often substantial, wealthy families could discreetly place an inconvenient relative out of sight and out of mind. Imagine the proprietor of such an establishment, balancing the need to appear reputable with the desire to maximize profits. Every penny saved on food, heating, staff wages, and genuine therapeutic care was a penny gained for the owner. This profit motive created a perverse incentive. The longer a patient stayed, the more money the proprietor made. There was little incentive for genuine recovery or discharge. Indeed, a cured patient was a lost income stream. This led to prolonged, often indefinite confinement, even for individuals who might have recovered with proper care. You realize that your prolonged stay, your inability to improve, might not be solely due to your illness, but also to the financial interests of the very people meant to be caring for you. The chilling thought that your freedom is directly tied to someone else's bottom line is a profound betrayal of trust. Then there were the public asylums, known as county asylums, built under the Lunacy Acts to house the pauper insane. While not strictly profit-driven, they were perpetually underfunded and overcrowded. Local authorities, keen to keep taxes low, often allocated minimal resources to these institutions. The sheer scale of the problem, a rapidly growing population, increasing urbanization, and a lack of social safety nets, meant that these asylums were always struggling to keep up with demand. Imagine a superintendent constantly battling budget cuts, forced to make impossible choices between adequate food, sufficient staff, or basic heating for the wards. Overcrowding was a chronic problem, directly stemming from this lack of resources. Wards designed for 50 patients might house 100 or more. This led to the breakdown of hygiene, the spread of disease, the lack of individual attention, and an increased reliance on mechanical restraint and sedation simply to maintain order. You witnessed the direct consequences of this underfunding. The stale air, the meager meals, the frayed uniforms, the exhausted attendants, the constant hum of misery, all direct results of a system starved of proper investment. Your modern understanding of public health funding and resource allocation makes this cycle of neglect and overcrowding tragically clear. The staff, as we discussed, were often poorly paid and overworked. This wasn't just due to a lack of compassion, it was an economic reality. Attendants were cheap labor readily available from the working classes. Investing in better wages, training, or more staff would have cut into profits for private madhouses or strained the already tight budgets of public asylums. This economic reality directly contributed to the quality of care, or lack thereof, on the wards. You realize that the indifference or occasional cruelty of an attendant might not always stem from malice, but from a system that dehumanizes both patient and caregiver through chronic underpayment and overwork. The construction of these grand, imposing asylum buildings was also a significant economic undertaking. They were often built to project an image of authority and permanence, but the initial investment often meant less money for ongoing care. The focus was on containment and control, on building impressive structures, rather than on investing in the nuanced, labor-intensive care required for genuine recovery. The very architecture of the asylum, while perhaps aesthetically imposing, was often a symbol of misallocated resources, prioritizing appearance and containment over genuine therapeutic function. The business of madness also extended to the legal and administrative processes. Doctors, magistrates, and other officials played roles in the commitment process, sometimes with financial incentives. While outright corruption might have been rare, the system was vulnerable to abuse, where individuals could be committed for convenience or financial gain, their sanity secondary to other motives. The lack of robust oversight mechanisms, particularly in private asylums, meant that abuses could persist for years, hidden from public scrutiny. So, as you peel back the layers of the Victorian asylum, you see that it was not just a medical institution, but a complex economic enterprise. The suffering of the patients, the inadequacy of the care, the pervasive neglect. These were often direct consequences of the profit motive in private institutions and the chronic underfunding in public ones. The business of madness meant that human lives were often reduced to balance sheets, and the bottom line frequently took precedence over the well-being and dignity of individuals. You realize that the horrors of the asylum were not just about individual cruelty, but about a systemic failure, driven by economics and a profound lack of societal value placed on the lives of the mentally ill. This economic lens reveals another, colder, more calculating layer to the asylum's inherent terror. That you've journeyed through the harrowing landscape of the Victorian asylum, experiencing its physical and psychological horrors. Now, as we draw towards the close of this journey, let's consider its enduring impact, its legacy. Forget the notion that these institutions simply vanished without a trace. The Victorian asylum, in its architecture, its philosophies, and its pervasive stigma, cast a long shadow, and its echoes, often subtle, can still be heard and felt in your modern world, shaping how you think about mental health even today. Look around you at your modern hospitals, your secure psychiatric units. While vastly different and immeasurably more humane, some architectural elements persist. The long corridors, the high ceilings, the institutional aesthetics, these can sometimes evoke a faint, unsettling memory of those earlier structures. The idea of a dedicated, often somewhat isolated facility for mental health treatment, while medically necessary in some cases, still carries a vestige of the Victorian separation of the mad from the sane. You might feel a subconscious unease in such places, an inherited anxiety that whispers of past confinement, even as your rational mind assures you of safety and care. The most potent legacy, however, is the enduring stigma surrounding mental illness. The Victorian era solidified the idea of madness as something to be feared, hidden, and ashamed of. The asylum became a symbol of this shame, a place where people disappeared, their reputations irrevocably tarnished. While your modern society has made strides in destigmatizing mental health, that deep-seated prejudice, that whisper of judgment, still exists. You might still find people hesitant to openly discuss their struggles, fearing societal rejection or professional repercussions. This reluctance, this internalized shame, is a direct inheritance from a time when mental illness meant banishment and public disgrace. The hushed tones, the euphemisms, the avoidance of direct language, these are all echoes of the Victorian era's profound discomfort with madness. Consider the language you use. Terms like lunatic, madman, crazy, insane. These are direct descendants of Victorian terminology, carrying with them the weight of centuries of misunderstanding and dehumanization. While less commonly used in formal contexts, they persist in colloquial speech, often used casually and without thought, perpetuating the very stigma that modern mental health advocates fight against. When you hear someone dismiss an idea as mad, or a person as crazy, you are hearing the distant echo of a Victorian attendant dismissing a patient's desperate pleas. The concept of institutionalization itself, while now largely focused on community-based care, still carries a negative connotation. The fear of losing one's autonomy, of being confined against one's will, of being put away. These anxieties are deeply rooted in the historical reality of the asylum. Even in modern ethical psychiatric care, the balance between patient rights and the need for involuntary treatment remains a complex and ethically challenging area, constantly grappling with the shadows of its past. You realize that the very idea of a mental hospital still evokes a certain apprehension, a residual fear of control and confinement. The Victorian asylum also inadvertently shaped the trajectory of mental health research. The sheer number of patients confined in these institutions provided a vast, albeit often poorly documented, pool for observation. While the treatments were crude, the systematic collection of patient data, however flawed, laid some of the groundwork for later psychiatric classification and understanding. The failures of the asylum system, its inability to cure the vast majority of its patients, eventually spurred reformers to seek new approaches, leading eventually to the development of modern psychopharmacology and psychotherapy. The horrors, in a grim twist, became catalysts for change. Even in contemporary popular culture, the Victorian asylum continues to exert its influence. Films, television shows, and novels often draw upon the Gothic imagery, the chilling stories, and the inherent terror of these institutions, perpetuating a romanticized, yet often inaccurate, view of mental illness and its treatment. While these narratives can be engaging, they also risk reinforcing outdated stereotypes and contributing to the very stigma we strive to overcome. You recognize the familiar tropes, the dark corridors and tormented souls, and realize how deeply ingrained these images are in the collective consciousness. Ultimately, the legacy of the Victorian asylum is a complex tapestry of both horror and progress. It serves as a stark reminder of what happens when fear, ignorance, and a lack of compassion govern the treatment of the most vulnerable among us. It's a cautionary tale, urging us to remain vigilant against the erosion of human rights, the dangers of unchecked power, and the insidious nature of stigma. You, living in your modern world, are the beneficiary of the reforms that eventually dismantled this brutal system, but you also carry, perhaps unknowingly, the echoes of its past. Understanding this legacy is not just an academic exercise, it is a vital step in ensuring that the horrors of the past are never repeated, and that the mentally ill are always treated with the dignity, respect, and compassion they deserve. The ghosts of the Victorian asylum may be gone, but their whispers, their warnings linger still. Segment 17. A Glimmer of Hope, Early Reformers. You've traversed the landscape of the Victorian asylum, a journey through profound suffering and systemic neglect. It's a heavy burden to carry, to witness such widespread dehumanization. But as we conclude, it's crucial to acknowledge that amidst the darkness, there were always voices, often faint at first, advocating for change, for humanity, for a better way. These were the early reformers, individuals who, despite immense societal inertia and scientific limitations, dared to challenge the status quo and push for a more compassionate approach to mental illness. Their efforts, though slow and arduous, represent a glimmer of hope, a testament to the enduring human capacity for empathy and moral courage. Imagine the sheer difficulty of being a reformer in that era. You are up against deeply entrenched prejudices, powerful economic interests, and a pervasive fear of madness. To suggest that the lunatics were human beings deserving of kindness, that their conditions were illnesses rather than moral failings, was often seen as radical, even dangerous. Yet, these individuals persisted, driven by a conviction that the current system was not only ineffective but morally reprehensible. They were often outsiders or individuals with a unique blend of scientific curiosity and profound humanitarian concern. One of the earliest and most influential figures was William Tuke, a Quaker philanthropist in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Appalled by the brutal conditions he witnessed in existing madhouses, he founded the York Retreat in 1796. His approach was revolutionary. He abolished chains and physical restraints, advocating for a humane environment, a structured daily routine, meaningful work, and moral persuasion. Patients were treated with respect, encouraged to engage in self-control, and provided with a tranquil domestic setting. Imagine the profound relief of a patient stepping into the York Retreat, a stark contrast to the dungeons and chains of other institutions. His work, while small in scale, became a powerful example of what moral treatment could truly achieve when implemented with genuine compassion and adequate resources. Across the Channel, Philippe Pinel in France was also a pivotal figure. In the 1790s, he famously ordered the unchaining of patients at the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris, a symbolic and revolutionary act. He advocated for careful observation of patients, the removal of physical restraints, and a more scientific, yet still humane, approach to understanding and treating mental illness. His work, alongside that of his student Jean-Étienne Esquirol, helped to professionalize the study of psychiatry and emphasize the importance of a therapeutic environment. These were not just theoretical pronouncements, they were practical hands-on changes that demonstrably improved the lives of countless individuals. In America, Dorothea Dix emerged as a tireless advocate in the mid-19th century. Shocked by the conditions she found in jails and almshouses where the mentally ill were often confined, she embarked on a lifelong crusade, lobbying state legislatures and the U.S. Congress for the establishment of humane, state-funded asylums. She traveled extensively, documenting the horrific abuses and presenting compelling evidence to political leaders. Her relentless advocacy led to the creation of dozens of new mental hospitals and significantly improved conditions in many others. Her work was a testament to the power of persistent, evidence-based advocacy in the face of widespread indifference. Imagine her courage, a lone woman challenging powerful institutions, her voice a beacon of light in the darkness. These reformers and many others were instrumental in shifting public opinion and legislative action. They published books and pamphlets, gave lectures and testified before parliamentary committees, gradually chipping away at the ignorance and fear that surrounded mental illness. They highlighted the abuses, exposed the neglect, and championed the idea that the mentally ill were not inherently different, but simply suffering from an illness that required care, not punishment. Their efforts led to the passage of lunacy acts in Britain and similar legislation elsewhere, which mandated inspections of asylums, improved conditions, and eventually led to the abolition of public viewing and the curtailment of the most brutal forms of restraint. However, it's important to remember that progress was slow and often uneven. Even with the best intentions, the sheer scale of the problem, the limited scientific understanding of the brain, and the perpetual underfunding meant that the ideals of the reformers were often diluted in practice. Overcrowding remained a persistent issue, and genuine therapeutic approaches struggled to gain widespread adoption. The asylum system, even with reforms, remained a place of confinement, often failing to truly rehabilitate patients. Yet, the seed of compassion once planted continued to grow. The legacy of these early reformers is profound. They laid the groundwork for modern mental health care, establishing the principle that those with mental illness deserve humane treatment, respect, and a chance at recovery. They demonstrated that positive change was possible, even in the most entrenched and seemingly hopeless situations. Their courage in challenging the prevailing attitudes of their time serves as an inspiration, reminding us that even in the darkest periods of history, there are always individuals who strive for a better, more just world. As you conclude this journey through the horrors of the Victorian asylum, you carry with you not just the chilling images of suffering, but also the quiet strength of these reformers. Their glimmer of hope reminds you that while human cruelty and ignorance can create profound darkness, the light of compassion and scientific inquiry can slowly but surely begin to illuminate the path towards a more humane future. Their voices, once whispers in the dark, now echo as a powerful testament to the enduring power of empathy and the relentless pursuit of human dignity. And in your modern world, you are a direct beneficiary of their tireless, often thankless work.